As you guys may remember, quite a while ago now, I reviewed the first half of Neil Gaiman's Sandman graphic novel and comic book series. Now, while that's a series that I am going to get back to and review the second half for you, I've actually been reading another series, which the title of this video up there will give this away, but I've been reading Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, a series which I have all the books of, and they've been sat on my shelf for a couple of years, and I just haven't picked up to read them. Just to give you a little bit of context, the Swamp Thing comic books are collected in these hardback editions here, divided into to books. This is book 1. And they start at issue 20. This is where Alan Moore took over the series. It was originally created and written by Len Wein, and I believe he did the first 19 issues, although I may be wrong, so don't quote me on that. I haven't read those because they're not terribly easy to get a hold of. But this starts at issue 20. You've got issues 20 to 27 in this book 1. So going in, I knew very little about the Swamp Thing. I've never read the original stuff, as I've just said, and I've started reading Scott Snyder's run on the New 52, which is the current DCU. So going in, I was fairly blind. I knew what to expect because I've read a lot of Alan Moore stuff, and I've really love his work. This, I have to say right off the bat that this series, this Swamp Thing series, has fast become one of my favourite comic books I think I've ever read. And not just that, but it's up there at the top literature I've read. I honestly am flabbergasted by how good this book is. So, good points. Alan Moore's writing is absolutely astonishing, and the artwork is by two gentlemen called Stephen Bissett and John Tottleben. Whether or not I've pronounced those right, I don't know. I could have just butchered them, so apologies if I got those wrong. So, looking at the artwork here, I've picked out a quick scene to show you. The artwork is some of the best that I think I've ever seen in a comic book. It's absolutely astonishingly detailed, quite realistic, but also very almost like cerebral, and there are quite a lot of dreamscapes, and the layout of the pages is slightly different than what you're probably used to in your kind of generic panel comic book. So down to the story. Now, book 1 starts with an issue called Loose Ends. This is essentially Alan Moore tying up all the loose ends from the first 19 issues which he didn't have a hand in writing. And it is a perfect jumping on point. Now, I was a bit trepidatious going in because I thought, will I be able to understand what's happening in Loose Ends? And really appreciate it, having not read the previous books. Now, yes, you can, basically. It is a perfect jumping on point. It does tie up some pre-existing characters, but to be honest, the way it's written, albeit it doesn't throw exposition at you, it gives you just enough information so that you can piece together what's already happened and enjoy the story for what it is. That issue particularly follows a character called Sunderland, an old general who wants to capture the Swamp Thing and experiment on him. And the issue does end with Swamp Thing being captured. Now, that's not so much a spoiler because it's in the first issue, and you pretty much know where it's going from the first page. It's after this, the next issue I believe is called The Anatomy Lesson, that Alan Moore really takes the book, takes the Swamp Thing as a whole and makes it his own. The Anatomy Lesson is basically exactly that. It's the Swamp Thing being dissected to see how it works, and this is essentially Alan Moore taking the character, stripping him back to his bare bones, and rebuilding him with a slightly different mythology to what we're used to. I believe that the anatomy of the Swamp Thing is slightly different to how it was when it originally was written. So essentially they reveal some things about the character that you probably weren't expecting, which do add a certain sense of tragedy. Now, I don't want to ruin what that is, but it is a tragic revelation that they reveal of the character in the Anatomy Lesson. Now, this issue also introduces a character called Jason Woodrue, who is essentially the first major villain that the Swamp Thing will have to face in Alan Moore's books. After the tragic character revelation that is revealed in the Anatomy Lesson, the Swamp Thing basically undergoes a sort of characteristic change. There is a certain issue where the Swamp Thing is absent for quite a bit of it because of this revelation, and I quite like the fact that Alan Moore takes his time to show how these plot points would affect the characters involved, and I thought that was really interesting. The book then goes on to tell the story of Jason Woodrue becoming evil, becoming the Floronic Man who who is essentially a man who can turn his skin and his hair into like a sort of a floral entity, and he is essentially wanting to wipe out the human race so that plants can rule the world. And this is essentially the first major arc in the Swamp Thing storyline. And it's very interesting, and the character of Jason Woodbury is quite an interesting villain. You even have the Justice League commenting on him, thinking, you know, we've always beaten him, he's never won any fight, so why is he acting up now? And I find it quite interesting. So that first arc is very good. We then, while that's going on, we introduce the love interest of Abigail Arcane, who is the niece of the Swamp Thing's arch nemesis, Anton Arcane, who is referenced in the very first few pages. This is something else that's been dealt with prior to Alan Moore coming onto the book. So they introduced the love interest, the niece of the arch nemesis. And the last couple of issues in the book do focus on her getting a job at a school for autistic children called Elysium Lawns, and a Monkey King is accidentally summoned and comes to wreak havoc on the school. Now, while that sounds like it might be completely random and stupid and not fit into the mythology, the way it's written, it does feel kind of organic to this world. And while I was reading it, I thought this could be, you know, this could be the tipping point where it's going to go downhill, but it didn't. I found that book to be just as good as what had come before. So we then move on to book 2. Now, essentially, book 2 focuses more, while it does have certain plot strands and subplots and all the rest of it, it certainly feels more like it focuses on the relationship between Swamp Thing, the character Alec Holland, and Abigail Arcane. Now, it starts with the retelling of the Swamp Thing's origins. It's told in a slightly different way. It's framed as if the Swamp Thing is looking back at his own origins, so it gives him license to maybe tweak the story a little bit from what was originally written by Len Wein. Now, essentially, the Swamp Thing is a character called Alec Holland, who was blown up in an accident in his laboratory, thrown with a load of chemicals into the swamp and became the Swamp Thing. They do change the origins slightly, and later on there's an issue where Abigail Arcane meets Cain and Abel, and they also reveal some other secrets about the origin. So the origin is certainly something that Alan Moore clearly wants to play with throughout the course of the first 2 books at least. I don't know about books 3 to 6 because I haven't read those yet. But he's certainly tweaking the origin as he goes, and he's certainly wanting to make adjustments. The story, as I said, does focus on the love between Alec Holland and Abigail Arcane, and it is a relationship that I find very interesting, especially in what is essentially a monster horror comic. Abigail Arcane is a very interesting, strong female character, and it's not the sort of female character you used to seeing in this sort of old-fashioned kind of, almost like 50s serial horror story. So the relationship itself is very good, and Abigail Arcane is very interesting, quite engrossing character. You could spend issues just with her without the Swamp Thing, without Alec. So it is a very strong platform on which to build a relationship. It also goes into her borderline, and I will say that, borderline abusive relationship with her husband, and this also leads to another kind of villain coming into the piece. They use the strange relationship of Abigail and her husband Matt Cable as a doorway for a villain to come into the story and use it as a platform, and that's really well done. So throughout the course of the book, you have this villain kind of messing with Abigail and Swamp Thing, and eventually, and this is a minor spoiler, but I don't know if people watching this will have already read it. Abigail's soul ends up in hell, and she is killed, and her soul is tossed into hell. And the villain that does it, and I won't ruin who that is, but is brilliant. Really, it's a brilliantly well written villain, because he says to Swamp Thing, I ripped the soul out from her, I felt it pulsing in my hand, and then I tossed it into the deepest, darkest caverns of hell just to hear it scream. The villain is nothing but pure evil, and it really does add a certain weight and jeopardy to the story. So we spend an issue with Swamp Thing going through a very well-rendered hell. He separates his consciousness from his body, goes into hell to find Abigail's soul, and it's so well written and well drawn. that you really completely kind of buy what you're reading. There's certain moments where he confronts a couple of important characters from his past while he's in hell. But essentially, it's a love story, and a very well told one at that. Just to give you an idea of the artwork in those issues, the dreamscapes are very well rendered and very artistic and very kind of original in a way, so I quite enjoyed that. The book itself is nothing short of fantastic. There is one issue in this book actually that was borderline. It's so different, but it's actually quite jarring. And to be honest, I probably need to read it again. But it's an issue called Pog, which is essentially about an alien race. Drawn, the characters look sort of like the Smurfs in spacesuits. If I can just show you that there. And this issue was so different that I thought, like, you know, what's this got to do with the story? And I understand that obviously when an artist and writers and are working on a monthly series of comics, they get behind sometimes and they need to hire temps to come in and fill the gap with an extra issue while they catch up. So I think this is essentially what Pog is a filler issue, but it is actually quite interesting. What starts off, when I started reading it, I thought, oh God, really, are we going to do this? But again, it's a testament to Alan Moore's writing that by the end of the issue I was completely sucked in and really enjoyed it. So no matter how trepidatious I've been with a couple of issues in the books, they've always been really strong, interesting issues. The book itself ends with an issue that is solely between the Swamp Thing and Abigail Arcane, and it's a very touching issue where they confront their feelings for each other and address the question of how they would be physical with each other in a relationship, and it's very well done. And I don't want to show you any artwork from this issue because I don't want to risk spoiling anything, but when you're reading the book, obviously you're holding it like this. There are certain points during that issue where you have to turn the book to basically read the rest. It's really quite well done, and I know that that's something that Scott Snyder on his run on Batman has been doing, but it looks like Alan Moore did it here first. So it's a very engrossing issue, very touching issue, and really does make me want to just pick up and devour book 3. So The Swamp Thing, these are books 1 and 2. You have issues 20 to 27 in book 1, and you've got issues 28 to 34 in book 2. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, without a doubt, one of the best comic book series I think I've ever read. It's poetry, it really is. It's so well written that you will just be completely engrossed. I've read these in about 3 days. I literally will sit after work and just devour them. They're absolutely brilliant. So I heartily recommend Swamp Thing, and I will be, there are 6 books in total, I believe, they're the spines. I will be reviewing all of them 2 at a time, so once I've read book 4, we'll have a review of book 3 and 4, and after The Swamp Thing we will go back and finish Sandman, which I have had a few messages and comments from people asking that I complete that series of videos, so I will be finishing to review Sandman, but I want to read the series from the beginning again because it's been a while. So that's Swamp Thing. If you've not read it already and you're wanting a graphic novel to get into that you think may get you into comic books in general, start with Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. It's absolutely brilliant.